Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Today, the subcommittee will consider a committee print of the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act, a committee print of the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act of 2010, and H.R. 4451, the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act, introduced by Representative Christopher Murphy. Pursuant to Rule 9, the chairman and ranking member will have 5 minutes each for opening statements, and any other subcommittee member who wishes to make an opening statement will have 3 minutes. The chair will now recognize himself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we will have a triple feature legislative session. First up, securing our electricity grid is a cyber thriller that, if we do not address it now, could one day turn into a horror movie for America. The second feature is Homestar, which I think will go from an unheralded small budget program to help families upgrade their homes and create jobs to become the summer blockbuster our economy needs. For a postlude, we have a brief story of redemption and renewal for a small dam in rural New England. Let's start with grid reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act, or GRID Act for short. Right now, our electrical grid is vulnerable to threats from terrorists and hostile countries. Our adversaries have motive, intent, and capability to exploit these weaknesses. Every one of our nation's critical systems, water, healthcare, telecommunications, transportation, law enforcement, and financial services, depends on the grid. The commercially operated grid provides 99% of the electricity used to power our critical defense facilities. Yesterday, we held a hearing with all of the commissioners of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to discuss this important issue. The commissioners emphasized the gravity of the threat we face and the inadequacy of existing law to deal with this threat. That is the same message we received at the hearing we held on this issue last October, and at the classified briefing for members that we convened that same month. After months of discussions between my staff and staff of Ranking Member Upton, Ranking Member Barton, and Chairman Waxman, we arrived at today's legislation. It is bipartisan. It reflects the important work on this issue by many members of Congress, including Mr. Barrow on this committee, and Chairman Benny Thompson, Yvette Clark, and others on the Homeland Security Committee. And it shows that when it comes to the nexus between national security and energy, all Americans agree we must chart a more secure path. Now let's turn to Homestar. This bill addresses 3 critical issues. The first is reducing the 27% unemployment in the construction sector by creating 168,000 new jobs. The second is helping homeowners save $9.2 billion on their energy bills. And the third is saving, in 2011 alone, an amount of electricity equivalent to 4 300-megawatt power plants and an amount of natural gas and home heating oil the equivalent of 6.8 million barrels of heating oil. Last week, we had a hearing on Homestar. Governor Engler of the National Association of Manufacturers said Homestar would spur manufacturing and contracting jobs in the United States. The CEO of Owens Corning explained that over 2/3 of U.S. homes are under-insulated, and most people will not improve their home's energy efficiency without financial incentives. The Department of Energy promised that Homestar will run more efficiently than the wildly popular Cash for Clunkers program. The CEO of Masco Home Services said Homestar will help make energy efficiency as glamorous as granite countertops. We also heard some concerns. Some of my colleagues expressed their aversion to home labeling. I want to clearly state that there are no labeling provisions in the Homestar legislation. We understand that outside stakeholders are working out their differences with regard to labeling. We are planning to continue working with concerned members to resolve these issues as we go forward. We also heard members' concerns about paying for Homestar. The legislation before this committee is an authorization only. We are here to discuss the policy, not the appropriation. The House will pay for this program before implementing it. But that question is not before this committee. And finally, we heard concerns that there is no cap on the cost of this program. In response to those concerns, I am introducing a manager's amendment that caps the program at $6 billion, consistent with language in the Senate. Today we have two bills of critical national importance before us. One will keep our families safe. One will help families save money. One will help close the portals hackers can use to shut down our electrical grid, and the other will help families replace windows and doors to cut electricity bills. So now let's get started. And first, I would like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Upton from the state of Michigan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate having this markup certainly this morning. Pleased to say that one of the bills before us certainly does represent a bipartisan collaboration of the full committee and subcommittee chairs and ranking members, and is very, very important. We have examined the issue of grid security for some time now, focusing on the vulnerability in electric generator control systems which allow remote access, enabling a bad actor to remotely destroy a generator, which could be catastrophic. There's no question that the legislation should be comprehensive. We should seek to fill as many security gaps as possible. The threats that we face are too much and too serious to only address a small portion of our vulnerability. The stakes could not be higher. This legislation will make our nation significantly more secure. Security of our nation's energy infrastructure from attack is one of the most important issues that I think our subcommittee and full committee will address. It's not an issue that we can take lightly. Energy literally powers our economy, as we all know. Even small price spikes and supply disruptions can wreak havoc on our economy. It is imperative that the security of our nation's energy infrastructure gets the attention and action that it deserves. This bipartisan legislation is a step in the right direction to protect our critical energy and defense infrastructure. We're also addressing the proposed Homestar legislation today. I've always been a proponent of an all-of-the-above energy policy. All of the above isn't just about all sources of energy. It also includes conservation and energy efficiency. Upgrading energy efficiency in homes clearly is the low-hanging fruit in reducing overall energy demand, and has added benefit of directly lowering home energy bills, which is of critical importance for working families struggling to get by. I support energy efficiency, and there are bipartisan ways to create incentives for home energy efficiency upgrades, but I don't see this particular legislation as fitting that bill. The Homestar legislation we're addressing today does come with a price tag of $6 billion. And I do appreciate your whittling efforts, because the hearing that we had last week showed that it could be as much as $23 billion. So we've cut it down from 23 to 6, and that's a step in the right direction. But at a time of historic budget deficits and runaway spending, we have to continue to look at ways to cut spending. And with all due respect to the Department of Energy, they are not equipped to run a program of this magnitude. According to the GAO, only 9,100 out of a planned 593,000 homes were weatherized in 2009. In my home state of Michigan, 385 homes were weatherized in 2009 at a cost of $4 million. There's still another $240 million left unspent. Nationally, about $500 million in stimulus funds have been spent so far on weatherization. That's only 10% of the $5 billion that was set aside. Why throw billions on top of that? Clearly, more money is not the issue. We should embrace the opportunity to fix some of the mistakes of the past. We owe it to our working families and the environment to get it right. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee considers three pieces of legislation to boost building energy efficiency, protect the electric grid, and encourage the development of sustainable hydroelectric power. The first piece of legislation is a bipartisan committee print to protect the electric grid from cyber, electromagnetic, weapon, and physical attacks, as well as from solar storms. And I would like to thank Mr. Barton and Mr. Upton for working with Mr. Markey on this legislation. Our staffs have worked closely together for 5 months to develop this committee print. They have had extensive discussions with interested stakeholders and agencies. It has been a good cooperative process that has produced good bipartisan legislation. I'd like to commend Mr. Barrow for his leadership on this issue. The bill he introduced last year serves as a starting point for this legislation. Chairman Thompson and the Homeland Security Committee also have worked very hard to educate members about the importance of protecting the grid from a range of threats and vulnerabilities. This bipartisan legislation will provide the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission with the authorities it needs to address imminent threats to the electric grid with emergency orders and longer-term grid vulnerabilities with standards written or approved by the Commission. This is an important national security and grid reliability issue. We've worked hard to strike a thoughtful balance between ensuring adequate protection for the grid and placing reasonable bounds on federal regulatory authority. And I encourage my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation. The second piece of legislation, known as the Home Star, this legislation would achieve the dual goals of jump-starting jobs in our construction and manufacturing sectors while helping Americans make their homes more energy efficient. I'd like to commend Peter Welch for his hard work in pushing to make this legislation a reality. Homestar would establish a rebate program for the installation of energy-efficient home upgrades. These rebates would encourage homeowners to hire contractors to install new heating and air conditioning systems, insulate their homes, and replace drafty windows and doors. That creates jobs, saves consumers money, and cuts pollution. Homestar has the support of a remarkably broad coalition that ranges from your local contractor to environmentalists to window manufacturers to Washington, D.C. trade associations. Why do all these groups support Homestar? Because it is a common-sense program that's good for the country. As at last week's hearing, a number of members raised the question of how this program would be paid for. It's a good question, one that Congress will need to answer before this proposal becomes law. However, I want to remind all members that the job of this committee is to craft sound policy that can address the nation's problems. We may face these funding issues shortly, but fortunately they do not need to be answered during this markup. Instead, if we are successful with our work, we will then work in turn with other committees, other members, and the House leadership to explore how our program may be adequately funded. I urge all members to help us get to that point by supporting Homestar legislation. And finally, the third piece of legislation is a bill sponsored by a member of our committee, Chris Murphy of Connecticut. The bill would authorize the FERC to reinstate licenses for 2 hydroelectric projects on the Farmington River and to transfer these licenses to the town of Canton, Connecticut. After a private company lost the licenses because it failed to begin construction, the town decided to proceed with these projects, which would use existing dams to generate electricity. Mr. Murphy worked extensively with the relevant agencies and stakeholders on this bill, including Canton and nearby towns, local and national environmental organizations, FERC, and the state regulators. The bill allows FERC to get these projects licensed expeditiously while ensuring that the appropriate environmental analysis is completed and considered. And I urge my colleagues to support this balanced bill. Today's legislation presents an opportunity for all of us to work together. I urge all members to seize that opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the chairman. We now turn to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Markey. Before I give my opening statement, since I've got Chairman Waxman here, are we marking up in Mr. Rush's subcommittee right now also?
I believe that that markup will start at 10.
Starts at 10. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have a regular order markup at subcommittee of these 3 bills today, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with the one which I consider to be the most important, which is the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act. Our electric grid is vulnerable to cyber attack, and if a nation state or terrorist were successful in crippling our electric grid, it could have devastating consequences for our society. The GRID Act should ensure that our most critical and vulnerable defense facilities are protected. This legislation has been and is bipartisan. I want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Waxman, and Ranking Member Upton for working together on this. It is a work in progress. There's still things that we're considering and taking comments on, but it has been bipartisan in the crafting stage, and hopefully will continue to be so. So I would support that we move this bill from subcommittee to full committee as we perfect it, and hopefully we will have a productive markup today and also in the near future at the full committee. The second piece of legislation is the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act. This bill has not been quite as bipartisan in the crafting stage, or the drafting stage, I should say. But having said that, you, Chairman Waxman, and Congressman Welch have reached out, especially Congressman Welch, to me and others on the minority side, and have shown an open mind. As I told you, Mr. Chairman, when you called me the other day on this particular bill, I think we can work together on it. There's still some things that need to be done, but we're making progress. I'm not so sure that we need to keep throwing money through government programs. I'm not sure that that's going to create as many jobs as the private sector will if we'll do some things to let the private sector make the decisions. But having said that, energy efficiency and retrofitting is a good idea. The proposed premise of this particular piece of legislation is sound. We're talking about housing retrofit and new homes being energy efficient. There's not anybody on either side of the aisle, Mr. Chairman, that can really argue against that. The problem is whether we put in so many government programs that the government itself begins to pick winners and losers and decide who gets the benefit and who doesn't. That's where people like myself begin to have some problems. Another issue before the bill before us is the cost of it. There has been improvement in the text that we're going to mark up today as a result of suggestions by myself and Mr. Upton and others. Instead of such sums as necessary, I'm told that the draft today has a specific amount. I believe that amount is $6 billion. This is a step in the right direction from such sums. I'm not sure that that is exactly the right amount, although I do admit that that's what the Senate has proposed also. I'm just not sure after the $10 billion in stimulus for weatherization funds and energy efficiency grants, that this bill and the Building Star and Rural Star, I'm just not sure that we can handle that amount of money. Again, having said that, the bill is something that we can work on, and if we don't get it all figured out today at subcommittee, hopefully we can work in a bipartisan fashion between subcommittee and full committee to iron out the differences. The last bill is the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act. I have to say that this bill was not the subject of a legislative hearing. It would seem to me that transferring a FERC license from a private company to a municipality is something that should have been the subject of a hearing. Why this legislation is necessary is something that I'm not totally cognizant of. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would simply say that it's something that we need to look at, and hopefully we can do that as we move towards the markup on that last bill. With that, I would yield back.
We thank the gentleman very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. In the interest of the time of the committee, I will ask unanimous consent to insert my full statement into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And make just a couple of comments that I think are important. I refer now to the GRID Act. It is very clear that there is need to protect the grid from cybersecurity and other threats. However, I am very much concerned about the seemingly broad authority granted to FERC in subsection C of the committee print. Further, I am concerned that the cost recovery provisions of the legislation could make it very difficult for some public utilities to recover the cost of complying with FERC grid security orders. While I do intend to support the bill for purposes of the markup today, I would ask you, Mr. Chairman, to work with me after today's markup and before the full committee markup to alleviate my concerns on these matters. Finally, H.R. 4451 is seemingly non-controversial, and I look forward to its consideration today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman, and of course, we will, as always, work very closely with the gentleman from Michigan. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, for an opening.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We look forward to the markup today on these three pieces of legislation. We all recognize the importance of cybersecurity and protecting the grid from physical and cyber attack. And I want to also thank Mr. Welch for reaching across the aisle on the Homestar Initiative legislation, which I do think is a good piece of legislation, although we do have concerns about the amount of money involved. But at least we do have a cap, and I look forward to working with the committee as we take this bill to the floor. I support the legislation, and hopefully we can have a pay-for by the time it gets to the floor. I yield back my time.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Chairman, I'll waive my opening statement.
Right. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's markup. The Homestar program, which is outlined in proposed legislation, would incentivize home energy retrofits and reduce unemployment in the construction sector. Specifically, it would help the Masco Home Services, which is one of the world's largest brand name manufacturers of consumer products for homes, including Milgard windows and doors, which employs 3,400 individuals in California generally and 180 employees in Sacramento specifically. More importantly, the Homestar Energy Retrofit would assist the Sacramento facility fully increase its current operating capacity of 40% and aid in rehiring many of the 440 Sacramentans who no longer work at the plant. This program would build on the roughly $11.8 million in Recovery Act investments that have already been delivered to the Sacramento region to support energy audits and energy efficiency retrofits in residential and commercial buildings. The legislation is in keeping with Sacramento's continuing actions to meet its air quality objectives, reduce its carbon footprint, lower families' utility bills, and create jobs. As we are also aware, the world has become critically reliant on digital communications, making military targets, civilian infrastructure, particularly our electric grid, vulnerable to cyber attack. The electric grid is a significant part of our country's infrastructure. Failure to take preventative steps to ensure its protection significantly endangers our economy. I look forward to our consideration of the GRID Act, which would expand the capability of existing regulatory authorities that respond to threats aimed toward our power system. It is my understanding that the public power utilities, including the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, have expressed some reservations about taking some action. As such, I am interested in hearing the views of my colleagues on this particular legislation and look forward to working with them to ensure that we have the tools and resources necessary to effectively defend our electric infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for calling today's markup. I yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Collinsville, Illinois, so when I saw the Collinsville hydroelectric reauthorization or the extension, I thought, how in the heck are they going to put a dam on Canteen Creek? So I found out that it wasn't in Illinois, it was in another state, and I look forward to helping move that. A couple other things is the Energy Star issue. I'm pleased to see at least some acknowledgement of budget constraint, if you consider $6 billion constraint, when I think the final number for cash for clunkers was $3 billion. I'm pleased to see that there's some acknowledgement that there was a concern about spending in the opening statements. The problem on this side is if you, there's an old saying, if you take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves. And there's a lot of us who are just saying, we've got to stop. We've got to stop authorizing. We've got to stop spending. And we've got to get down the debt. So if there is an issue, it's not with the policy. It's with the authorization and the growth of government and spending. And hopefully we'll continue to work those things out. I do have an issue that hopefully we can work on. I mentioned numerous times on geothermal applications and may address that as that comes up. Also on the transmission bill, cybersecurity bill, I'm curious why a nuclear electromagnetic pulse is not being debated or discussed. When I was a young lieutenant in Germany in the early 80s, we were readily afraid of airburst electromagnetic pulse that would just wipe out the electronics. I was told, staff to staff, that if that happens, we got bigger problems. I'm not sure we have bigger problems. We're so reliant on electricity and solid-state components, it just fries them out. And we're back in the horse and buggy age with candles. And, we don't have a lot of candles around our house. So I would hope that we would really seriously address this. There's also a Section C of the bill that I think is duplicative, and I look forward to discussing that. I think that's problematic, and I don't know if that's been, maybe I can learn as to why we're doing what we're doing there. But we're moving forward. I look forward to working with you, and yield back my time.
We thank the gentleman very much. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our Republican colleagues. I'm sorry.
I apologize to the gentleman. I think to keep in the correct order, I should recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, first. I apologize to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very thankful for you to convene today's markup to report important grid security and job creation legislation. The proposed energy security and Homestar bills we are considering today have the potential to significantly benefit our country, and I look forward to considering the initiatives this morning. Before entering Congress, I spent most of my career developing new energy technologies. I know from personal experience that increasing efficiency is one of the most effective steps we can take to meet our country's energy policy objectives and to lower electrical bills for our consumers. Equally important, however, smart policies designed to incentivize investments in energy efficiency have the potential to put many, many Americans to work. And that's the key to this bill, in my opinion. Homestar proposal would offer rebates for two different levels of efficiency investments, which could potentially attract broad interest and directly create jobs in the construction industry. If successful, this program would have a corresponding benefit for manufacturers producing materials used in retrofits and produce a positive effect in the wider economy. I look forward to today's markup and hope that we can further improve this proposal. I hope that it can be done on a bipartisan basis. I'm also particularly interested in considering ways to make sure that the low-income households are able to benefit from efficiency enhancement that will lower their utility bills and create jobs again. I also want to thank Chairman Markey for including grid security legislation in today's markup. Protecting the security of our own electrical infrastructure and the critical defense facilities served by power industry is an important priority in the new era of threats such as cybersecurity attacks. I'm especially gratified that the grid security bill before us today is a product of extensive bipartisan discussions. We're all unified in our efforts to vigorously work to keep our country safe, and I'm hopeful that we will continue to work across party lines to report legislation from this committee that enjoys bipartisan support, enhances security, and provides reasonable compliance options and assistance to stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great, gentleman. Time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling today's markup on these important bills. I'm very pleased we have worked in a bipartisan fashion on the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act. I think it's of the utmost importance, and I'm pleased to support it today in the subcommittee. Due to the nature of our infrastructure, it is no surprise that reports of cyber vulnerabilities and threats to the grid have only increased in recent years. Additionally, it has become apparent that our electric grid is vulnerable to cyber attack by terrorists or other nations. Clearly, there is a need to better protect our national grid. I believe this bill will help us achieve that. The bill would amend the Federal Power Act to add a new section giving FERC new authorities to protect the electric grid against cyber and other threats and vulnerabilities. In addition, subsection B of the new section gives FERC authority to issue emergency orders if the President notifies the Commission that a grid security threat exists. It also seeks to better protect our critical defense facilities, which is extremely important. Regarding the Homestar legislation before us today, there are many promising aspects to it. I believe that it is crucial that Congress focuses on creating a climate that promotes job creation. I also believe that sound energy efficiency measures will certainly help decrease the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. However, I'm greatly concerned about deficit spending on whichever pay-for may be used to offset the spending of this $6 billion program. I also have concerns about the implementation of this bill and that fact that it seems to have picked winners and losers in the technology and labor sectors. I hope that we can work together to fix some of these concerns before we move this bill further. Again, I thank you for holding the markup. I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Again, the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, the principal author of the
thank you very much,
Homestyle legislation.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Waxman, thank you as well. But I want to thank our Republican colleagues, Mr. Upton and Mr. Barton, for your extraordinary help. And also, here's, in my discussions with our colleagues on the other side, I heard three concerns. One principal agreement that less is more, and the more we can conserve energy, the better that is for all of our citizens and for the environment. But the three concerns I heard expressed, one was cost, legitimate concern, and I understand that there's a move now to put a specific figure in here rather than such sums as may be authorized. So I think that was a very good suggestion, and obviously there's room for discussion about what that right number is. But where that number came from, as I understand it, is recommendations from experts about the amount that would make this program really be successful. And obviously there may be some room for debate there, but that's where that number came from. But thanks for that suggestion. Second, Mr. Upton, you expressed some concerns about the weatherization program and whether that would be a problem here, legitimate concerns. I recall Mr. Governor Engler's testimony, and he made a real distinction between the two programs that I thought was quite helpful and reassuring to me. The weatherization program had several layers of bureaucracy to go through, the federal government down to the state, down to the CAP agency, down to the home. This is very direct. It's using that infrastructure that's out there of our local big box stores and our local hardware stores, our local builders who are light on work because of the housing crisis, and then the homeowner who's got a direct stake in making certain that they get value for what they are putting in. So I just invite you to listen to Governor Engler's explanation and see if that makes a difference for you. And then this third question of picking winners and losers, I don't think that's a big problem, and I'll tell you why, because we're making this available to all those contractors, all those stores, and all those homeowners. So it is relying on what is already in existence rather than trying to create something new. So I hope those changes that we've made meet some of the concerns that were very helpful that your side expressed. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too am relieved that we are finally to mark up on some of these bills because of the security of our nation's electricity grid, essentially the lifeblood of our economy and our society, is of the utmost importance. Members of this committee have been briefed, both in classified and in non-classified settings, of just how vulnerable certain sectors of our electric grid actually are. Certainly in the events that have transpired in the last 10 years, this becomes of critical importance. And while I'm a firm believer that the electric grid is most effectively maintained at the state level, where local public utility commissions will always be more responsive to citizens' concerns than the federal government, I do agree with my colleagues that within the realm of national security, a greater role for the federal government is necessary. So I hope that much of the discussion today will focus on exactly where the balance between state and federal authority should properly lie. One area in this legislation that I believe needs to be looked at more closely is the emergency powers authority of the President that would trigger the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to take actions to prevent attack on our grid infrastructure. I believe the legislation must be improved in the area of congressional oversight of this presidential power. Many of our citizens of both political parties and independents are concerned about the overreach of presidential power, and I am among that group. Because of the expediency in holding this markup, I ask that the chairman commit to working with interested members of this committee to provide for an adequate congressional oversight for this new power. Similarly, the Homestar legislation being considered today is not yet ready for prime time. I am pleased that the manager's amendment today finally acknowledges this committee's responsibility as an authorizer and does place a cap on the program. Although the $6 billion figure is now better than an unacceptably vague "such sums as may be necessary" language, I still believe in a time when most Americans are tightening their belts at home and cutting back their budgets, Congress should be leading by example and not continue to expand federal programs. I have advocated that I have long been an advocate of the inherent incentives to energy efficiency. As I stated last week, it may be the one area where Chairman Markey, myself, Representative Roscoe Bartlett can all be on the same page. But how much this bill costs at a time when we need to be tightening our fiscal belt, not expanding it, is of genuine concern, and we need considerable time to discuss this. I would hope that over the Easter break, these discussions will continue and something can be worked out. I am relieved this committee is finally moving forward with legislation to protect our power grid from potential attacks. We on this committee well know how deep is our vulnerability. I hope the few issues left with this legislation can be worked out and we can move it in an expeditious fashion. And I thank the gentleman for his attention and time, and I will yield back.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Chairman, I thought Mr. Barrow was here earlier.
I thank the gentleman. Yeah, I think you're correct. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
Well, I thank the chair. I thank Mr. Green. I just want to put in a word of support for the GRID Act we're taking up today. This committee print is a reincarnation of a bill that I introduced last year, H.R. 2165, the Bulk Power System Protection Act of 2009, which I introduced with the co-sponsorship of Chairman Waxman and Subcommittee Chairman Markey. As has been said, I certainly agree that the threats to our critical energy infrastructure in this country are extremely real and extremely serious, and we need to do something about it. I'm very proud of the work that's gone into this so far, but it is a work in progress, and I believe that good process produces good product, and so I look forward to continuing that process today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, we thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chairman working with Ranking Member Barton on the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act. This important legislation will improve the security and safety of our electric grid and help to protect a critical national asset. I think the goals of the proposed Homestar Energy Retrofit Act are admirable, and I look forward to working with Congressman Welch and commend him for his work on this, as well as the rest of the committee, to focus on becoming more energy efficient while putting Americans back to work. However, I remain concerned about the effectiveness of past programs that have cost the American taxpayers billions of dollars, specifically the weatherization program included as part of the failed stimulus bill, and the prospects for the success of this program. I would hope our committee not only limit our action on energy policy to the bills before us today, but to actually creating a comprehensive energy policy that allows us to open up the vast natural resources in America, to further develop the oil and gas reserves throughout our nation, to encourage more safe nuclear power. Current administration policies actually increase taxes on exploration of oil and gas, which will make us more dependent on Middle Eastern oil and run millions more jobs out of the country. The only way to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil is to implement a comprehensive national energy policy like the American Energy Act which embraces an all-of-the-above strategy to create millions of high-paying jobs in America, to generate billions of dollars to pay down our debt, and to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. So I hope we will ultimately get into discussions on comprehensive legislation that will actually make our country more energy independent and create more jobs in this country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. Under the rules of the committee, members are recognized during markups by order of seniority regardless of the time of their arrival. And so those are the rules, and we appreciate the generosity and beneficence of the gentleman from Texas in yielding his time to the
Mr. Chairman, I know
Georgia, and we just would like to say that he did so, notwithstanding his rights under the rules to be recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you've been here 30 years, and I've only been here 18, but someday I'll understand those rules on recognition. But I do appreciate it, and I was glad I was able to let my colleague from Georgia. We have just a little bit of Texas accent and nowhere near a Georgia accent. So, but Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding the markup today on the GRID Act, committee print, the Homestar Energy Retrofit print, and the H.R. 4451, the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act. As technologies evolve and our electric grid becomes increasingly interconnected, we must be vigilant to protect our infrastructure against malicious security attack from terrorists, criminal groups, hackers, or any other potential adversaries. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 provided for mandatory liability standards addressing cybersecurity threats for the bulk of the power system. Under this authority, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, which represents electric utilities and stakeholders, developed 9 mandatory reliability standards for critical infrastructure protection, which FERC has approved with some modifications. While a strong first step, many industry and governmental experts believe these reliability standards must be strengthened in order to better identify critical assets and respond to imminent cybersecurity threats. The Bipartisan GRID Act committee print provides new authorities to FERC to protect against grid security vulnerabilities to the bulk power system and to critical defense facilities. I look forward to crafting a policy where FERC and industry partners can work collaboratively to address one of our most pressing national security needs. Next, the Homestar Retrofit print seeks to increase employment in the construction sector while significantly increasing home energy efficiency in America. It's estimated that the program will create approximately 168,000 more jobs in the construction and manufacturing sectors while promoting American-made goods and services. I'm hopeful the Department of Energy and state offices and contractors will be able to work together efficiently and effectively administer the program and have it rolled out quickly for a maximum impact. And I'll also look forward to considering H.R. 4451, the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act, which is introduced by our colleague Chris Murphy from Connecticut. And this, I guess, definitive local bill, since even though, as our colleague from Illinois said, we may represent a Collinsville, this is the only one that's impacted is in Mr. Murphy's district. So I yield back on to my time.
Great. We thank the gentleman very much. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Parker. Mr. Griffin. Excuse me.
2 last names. It's been with me all my life. Happens all the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the opportunity to participate in the markup. In our current environment, with our nation on a war footing, both overseas and at home, few attacks could be as harmful as attack on our nation's electric grid. If well orchestrated, it certainly has the potential to plunge the entire nation or significant parts of it into chaos. Our nation's electrical grid is a critical center of gravity that our enemies could choose to exploit at any time. This is an important hearing because our critical infrastructure must be adequately protected from such an attack, and there's much that we can do to mitigate the risk. I certainly applaud this bill, and in addition to that, the Homestar bill is, I believe, conceptually very, very important to America at this particular time. I'm hoping that if I have permission, I would like to offer 2 amendments to the Homestar bill. Energy efficiency is an important step. We need to be less dependent. We say that all the time. from foreign energy sources. However, at this particular time in our nation's life, we are financially very sensitive, and we need to be as responsible as we can be in financing the bills that we hope to pass. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentle lady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening the markup, and I learned some new gem about the ways of this committee every day, so thank you very much. The important bills under consideration this morning highlight the committee's attention to strengthening the economic security for hardworking families and to safeguard our nation's most critical assets, one of which is the first bill before us, the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act, which seeks to create a home energy efficiency retrofit rebate program. The proposed bill would allow up to 3 million homeowners to improve the energy performance of their homes through investments in energy-efficient appliances, insulation, and improved heating and cooling systems. Once Homestar is up and running, it's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs that cannot be outsourced, reduce energy use in millions of homes, and save homeowners billions in energy bills for years to come. Homestar is a win-win-win for consumers, our economy, and the environment, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. The other bill that we will vote on this morning will establish federal emergency authority in the case of a cyber attack on the electric grid. I commend the committee's leadership for work in a bipartisan manner to advance the GRID Act. Recent newspaper headlines and television news coverage have highlighted the serious security threats to the electricity system in the country. The inadequacy of our government's authority to respond to and prevent these threats is very troubling. And I believe strongly that we need to address these gaps in federal authority to protect against these dangers. That's what this bill does, and that's why I will be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for marking up these important security bills. I yield back.
Great. The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we begin consideration of two critical measures, one that addresses our nation's security and another that puts Americans back to work while improving energy efficiency. The threat of someone hacking into the control systems of an electric generator or other equipment presents a substantial concern. These attacks, perpetrated with the intent to disrupt service in the short term or wreak long-term damage and havoc by damaging equipment, could have a significant impact not only on our national security but also on our economic security. I appreciate the chairman and the ranking member and their efforts in working together to address the security of the grid. I understand that there are some remaining outstanding issues that need to be examined, and it is my hope that the necessary conversations can happen between now and full committee consideration. In my mind, a remaining vulnerability is the shortage of large transformers. I remain open to working with my colleagues on ways to address this issue. Particularly, I'm interested in incentivizing the domestic production of large transformers. Unfortunately, these devices are all manufactured outside of the United States, and replacement can take up to 2 years. Incentivizing the transformer industry to manufacture domestically would protect our national security by preventing persons at overseas manufacturing plants from having access to control system schematics and even software program passwords. It would also create domestic jobs during these difficult economic times. Although there are barriers to designing a program that incentivizes domestic manufacturing, I'm certainly open to any ideas that my colleagues may have to develop this critical market. On the Homestar program, I thank the committee for working with me to address some concerns that I've raised. Today, I'll be offering an amendment to ensure that as homes are retrofitted, we do not lose sight of health and safety concerns, particularly indoor air quality standards. Carbon monoxide can build up if efforts are not taken to properly ventilate a home. And this issue further highlights the importance of proper training so that contractors are prepared to quickly catch critical safety issues. I do also have some issues that I would like to work with the committee on between now and full committee consideration. Namely, we must ensure that states like Wisconsin, with a high number of small contractors, those with under 20 employees, are not overwhelmed by the big box store operations, which are better equipped to pass on costs. These small contractors are particularly sensitive to the way we establish the certification requirements and any high administrative fees. We must also ensure that the Homestar program is compatible with other programs, such as energy efficiency community block grants and state energy efficient appliance rebate programs. And while the legislation outlines the need for coordination with other programs, I think this point cannot be underappreciated. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to continuing to work with you as these bills move forward. I yield back my remaining time.
Great. We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I've looked forward to this hearing because I think some of this legislation is really going to be an asset to the people that I represent. With this unusually cold winter, Mr. Chairman, a huge number of my constituents have expressed concerns about high utility bills. While there are many reasons for these high bills, one of the biggest is that their homes, many of them built 40, 50, 60 years ago, are terribly inefficient. The Homestar program, created by legislation that we mark up today, provides people who don't qualify for weatherization assistance an opportunity to retrofit these older homes with new windows, doors, and insulation, investing their own funds and getting a little help from their neighbor at the same time. It will put contractors back to work building this country in a greener way. I am pleased with the quality assurance framework of the draft, encouraging the recruitment of minority and women-owned small businesses and contractors to be a part of the program. While the stimulus has done much to stabilize our economy, it has been slow to reach minority-owned businesses. A recent Associated Press story highlighted that while black-owned businesses make up 5% of the market, they have only received 1% of the stimulus contracts. While I appreciate the language, I hope that we can continue to work to improve outreach of these and other programs to bring green jobs to underserved populations. These communities have been hard hit by the recession and need a fair share of the government's investment to achieve stability. As for the GRID Act, cybersecurity has been a problem since the inception of connected computers, but we have heightened the potential impact of cyber attacks as we have become exponentially more interconnected. In July of this year, 3 waves of cyber attacks affected computers in the U.S. and South Korea, hitting nearly 24 U.S. government agencies, including the White House, shutting down the Treasury and the Federal Trade Commission websites. Well, while the cost of this attack appears to be fairly minimal, the scope of the attack and the ability of the hackers to reach our resources gives me some concern. Why we must have resources available to ensure, Mr. Chairman, the reliability against this threat, and I appreciate the bipartisan offering to address the problem. As always, we must work to ensure the reliability of the grid without placing undue burden on the ratepayer. Thank you. I yield back.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired, and all time for opening statements from members has expired. So we will now turn to the consideration of the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act. The chair now calls up the committee print of the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act. The clerk will report the title of the measure.
Committee print dated March 22nd, 2010 HR. A bill to amend the Federal Power Act to protect the bulk power system and electric infrastructure critical to the defense of the United States from cyber security and other threats
Without
and
objection, the
vulnerabilities.
bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Chair hears no objection. The bill will be considered then as read, and the chair will now recognize himself to speak in favor of the GRID Act. As I said in my opening statement, there are few more pressing national security issues than grid security. The legislation now before the subcommittee is the product of extensive bipartisan discussions between my staff and the staff for Ranking Member Upton, Ranking Member Barton, and Chairman Waxman. It is not set in stone, and we look forward to the input of members of this subcommittee and of the full committee as we move forward. But we believe it represents a good faith bipartisan effort to adopt rigorous but reasonable measures to protect the American public and America's national security against these growing threats. The GRID Act has 3 basic components. First, the bill establishes federal authority to take action in case of emergency if the President identifies an imminent threat to the security of the bulk power system or any other parts of the grid that serve critical defense facilities. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can issue an emergency order requiring measures to protect against this threat. This authority covers threats from cyber attacks, electromagnetic weapons, solar storms, or direct physical attacks. Second, the legislation establishes several measures to protect the bulk power system against key vulnerabilities, so that if and when an emergency does happen, we are already prepared. Most important, if FERC identifies a vulnerability in the bulk power system that has not adequately been addressed through a NERC reliability standard under Section 215 of the Power Act, the FERC has the authority to require interim measures to protect the bulk power system. If and when NERC comes forward with a reliability standard that adequately addresses the vulnerability, FERC must approve that standard and rescind its interim measure. This ensures that when we know of a serious vulnerability to attack that's not being adequately addressed, FERC can act to protect our national security without being held hostage to potential delays or weaknesses in NERC's industry-led standard-setting process. In addition, the legislation specifically directs FERC to establish measures to protect against the Aurora vulnerability within 6 months of enactment. That vulnerability was identified nearly 3 years ago, and NERC still has not approved requirements optimizing to protect against it. That is unacceptable. It must be fixed, and it was the subject of the top secret briefing which this committee received last fall. The legislation deals with other vulnerabilities through the existing NERC standard setting process. It requires the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to direct NERC to establish reliability standards to deal both with geomagnetic storms caused by solar flares and with ensuring the availability of adequate supplies of large transformers. Experts agree that it is only a matter of time before we experience a geomagnetic storm of sufficient magnitude to destroy a large portion of our transmission system, potentially causing hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. The grid can be cost-effectively hardened against such a storm using simple technologies. The bill will require that cost-effective measures be taken. Large transformers are critical to the functioning of the grid, are not manufactured in the United States, and can take over 2 years to replace if disabled. The bill will ensure, through NERC reliability standards, that we have adequate programs in place to restore the grid if a significant attack on such transformers were to occur. And finally, the legislation establishes new federal authority to protect portions of the grid that are not part of the bulk power system, but that serve critical defense facilities. The bill directs the President to identify not more than 100 facilities in the United States, including Guam and other territories, that are the most critical to the defense of the United States and that are most vulnerable to the disruption of their external power supply. FERC must consult with DOD or whatever entity operates these critical facilities to determine whether the non-bulk power system electric infrastructure serving the facility is adequately protected against a cyber or electromagnetic weapon attack. If not, FERC is authorized to require measures to protect that part of the grid. Importantly, these measures are only required to the extent that the defense facility is willing to pay for them, so no undue burden will be imposed on ratepayers living near such facilities. DOD can then make informed, cost-conscious choices as to what levels of protection is appropriate. I urge all members to support this important bipartisan national security legislation, and I turn to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been an issue that has been on our front burner for some time now, extending back to the last Congress. And I would say that I think most members, we have a new member serving now on the panel, Mr. Griffith from Alabama, but most of us have participated in not only the public meetings, but the private classified briefings as well. And as a consequence, we are in fact aware of the vulnerabilities that would be catastrophic to our nation. And I believe that it would be a dereliction of duty should we not move legislation to try and make sure that such an attack does not take place here in this nation. And I commend you and the bipartisan work, I know Mr. Barton does as well, Mr. Waxman, for in fact putting this issue on the front burner so that we can move legislation, hopefully work with our Senate colleagues, but actually get a bill out today. There are perhaps some rough edges on this bill, and we look forward to working with all members to strengthen and improve in a constructive way this legislation between now and when it goes to full committee. But I would like to think that all of us would support this bill, knowing what we do know, to take the appropriate steps to in fact prevent something that would be just catastrophic to our nation. So I commend you. This is a very important duty of this subcommittee, and I'd like to think that we'll get it done without undue trouble. Thank you.
We thank the gentleman very much. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on the opening statement and just put on the table, hopefully a debate on Section 2, the FERC-NERC debate, and then who does what when. EPAC 2005 really gave NERC the authority. We got to be careful that we don't have duplicative standards, and we have to be careful that NERC allows for a funding mechanism where, NERC allows for a funding recovery in the process where FERC does not. So we need to, I think there's some cleanup here. The intent's good. We have to be able to move. There's got to be a backstop, a time certain, and a way to indicate a need to move rapidly. But again, a lot of times good intentions create a lot of problems. So I look forward to working with you with that, and I yield back my time. I would yield.
And we do agree with the gentleman. We want to work with him between now and the full committee just to make sure that all of those concerns are dealt with.
Thank you.
We thank the gentleman. By the way, we apologize to all the people who are here for the Homestar Amendment. When you figure out what the difference between NERC and FERC is, but those who are going to stay for the Homestar Amendment, who are here for the grid security, believe me, there's a whole language that they have as well that they've developed that makes it difficult for people to follow, although if it was put in plain English, it would be very clear what was happening. Are there other members seeking recognition? There being no further discussion, I now move that the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment forward the committee print of the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act is favorably forwarded to the full committee. We thank the members for their cooperation on that first bill. We now turn, and the chair now calls up the committee print of the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act of 2010.
Committee print dated March 22nd, 2010. A bill to provide the establishment of a Homestar Retrofit.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I have already spoken on this, and the chair will recognize himself to offer a manager's amendment in the form of an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title.
Without objection, the manager's amendment in the form of an amendment will be considered as having been read. The chair has no objection. And so the manager's amendment is now before us. And the The
Gentlemen,
chair-
just yield for just 1 second. Knowing that we have a manager's amendment before us, I just want to make unanimous consent that any amendments offered by any member, amendments, because they might have been drafted to the original bill, that they be considered as to the manager.
Without objection, that is so ordered. The chair will now recognize himself for a brief opening statement. The Homestar Energy Retrofit Act of 2010 will spur 168,000 jobs, save over $9 billion in home energy costs, and make up to 3 million homes more energy efficient. It will save in 2010 alone an amount of electricity equivalent to 4 300-megawatt power plants and an amount of natural gas and home heating oil the equivalent of 6.8 million barrels of oil. Members should have a document that outlines the changes between the draft circulated for last week's hearing and the one that you have before you today. However, I will summarize these differences for you briefly. This amendment includes 3 substantive changes and 5 technical changes to the Homestar discussion draft circulated on March 17th. The first substantive change is a response to concerns from members about appropriations limitations for Homestar. The amendment now limits the appropriations authorization to $6 billion. The second substantive change allows the Secretary of Energy to adjust verification rates on Homestar projects. With this amendment, if a contractor has an exceptionally good performance record, the Secretary can reduce the amount that the contractor's work is checked by a quality assurance provider. If any contractor isn't doing his or her job well, then they will find themselves under more scrutiny. We want to create jobs and not headaches. The final substantive change in the amendment will require quality assurance program managers to provide a list of quality assurance providers and minimum provider standards. This will assist the implementation of the quality assurance program. There are also 5 technical changes included in this amendment. These changes in the amendment clarify contractor responsibility, clarify rebate aggregator responsibilities. They also ensure that the financing provisions of the Homestar Efficiency Loan Program are not permitted to support securitization of funds. They clarify that the testing of thermal efficiency be completed by equipment and not quality assurance providers, and fixes a typographical error in a provision related to windows and skylights. These changes were targeted to address the concerns of the members. They are also intended to streamline and improve the Homestar program. I want to thank members on both sides for their input and as we move forward on making the jobs and the energy benefits of the Homestar program a reality. Does any member at this point seek recognition? The gentleman from Illinois, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
At this point, I think the gentleman's amendment is in order, so the chair will recognize the gentleman for that purpose, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Shimkus, page 26, line 3, and page 27, line 3. Redesignate
Mr. Chairman, I
paragraph
ask
10
unanimous
and
consent
11.
that
Without
amendment be considered
objection,
as read.
the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Chairman Waxman for having some discussions prior to the offering of this amendment. It's a simple amendment. It just, as I talked with my colleague Peter Welch, this would add geothermal pumps to the program. For those who know about geothermal applications, it just takes the almost constant temperature of the ground and recirculates it up to really mitigate the high cost of heating or cooling, depending on which season it is. They're really efficient. They can reach the 400 to 600% efficiency in terms of energy delivered versus energy drawn. And they're very expensive, but the payback is depending upon the cost of heating and cooling could be 5 to 10 years, which is in line with a lot of the other efficiency procedures. We did address an issue that was brought up by Democrat committee, majority committee staff about the dual applications, and so I think we've worked that out on the last line of the amendment, which is the sweeping 20 or 25D after 25C. And with that, Mr. Chairman,
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
We thank the gentleman. Geothermal heat pumps are a valid and efficient technology for providing heating and cooling. I'm glad to see that our colleague has provided an amendment here to ensure that it is included in the legislation, and I want to thank him for working with us to accomplish that goal. And I support the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that's all I have. I yield back to.
Beautiful. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on this amendment? The gentleman from Vermont.
I just want to thank the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus. This totally fits into the goal here, and it's a common sense amendment. It's another way to help us achieve the overall goal. So thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. Appreciate it.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. Chair sees no other members seeking recognition. The vote then comes on the Shimkus amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The Shimkus amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentlelady from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin. At the end of Section 3, add the following new
I ask
subsection.
unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Yeah, without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you. It is a very simple amendment, Mr. Chairman, one that was raised to my attention in consultation with the Wisconsin Energy Conservation Corporation. It ensures that as contractors perform their retrofit work, they also maintain and comply with all applicable federal, state, and local health and safety code requirements. In Wisconsin, where every home has combustion equipment, or almost every home does, it's usually located in the basement, and much of the equipment is atmospherically vented. And when you tighten up the shelf of a house using proper insulation and air sealing techniques as outlined in Homestar, it creates the possibility of backdrafting of carbon monoxide into the home, clearly a very dangerous situation. As we make home energy efficiency improvements, ensuring health and safety is of utmost concern. And this highlights the importance of having trained contractors who can quickly identify and fix these problems. So I urge my colleagues to accept this amendment.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The vote then comes on the gentlelady's amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shattuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It's Shattuck number 136.
The clerk will report Shattuck amendment number 136.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Shattuck of Arizona. Page 26, line 22, strike or and insert.
Without objection, the gentleman's amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Arizona will be recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I believe most members of the committee know, the committee print allows a rebate for natural gas tankless water heaters under the Silver Star program. However, electric tankless water heaters, while more efficient than natural gas and much easier to install in many locations, more efficient by a factor of 15 to 25%, have not been included in the rebate program. Furthermore, natural gas is available to only a fraction of homes in America, roughly 48%, leaving the other 52% of homes in America with no tankless option. My amendment simply adds a rebate for electric tankless water heaters to the Silver Star program, and notably, at a 96% efficiency rate, the legislation requires only an 82% efficiency rate for natural gas tankless water heaters. As I think the chairman knows, tankless water heaters are a much more efficient method of heating water. They are used broadly throughout much of the rest of the world, used very extensively in Europe. The notion is that it makes no sense to heat water and store it and have it get cold and then have to heat it again and store it and then let it get cold and then heat it again and store it. Whereas a tankless water heater located close to the faucet where hot water is needed can instantly heat the water, allow its use, and results in dramatically more efficient use of that energy. and a reduced waste of energy by storing hot water.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman. I support the inclusion of electric tankless water heaters that my colleague has introduced. It does meet that nexus of efficiency and availability needed to make Homestar successful, and we thank the gentleman for making the amendment.
I assume that means you're going to accept the amendment?
Yes, we are.
I think I learned a long time ago to take yes as an answer. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Vermont.
Well, just briefly to thank the member from Arizona. We have a company in Vermont that does this good work too. So I appreciate your very constructive addition to the legislation. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, and I compliment the gentleman on his work on this legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. So the chair does not see any other members seeking recognition. So the vote comes on the amendment of the gentleman from Arizona. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The Shadegg amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the tradition of this trend of approving amendments, I've got an amendment at the desk that hopefully will be non-controversial.
The chair will, the clerk will report the Scalise amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Scalise. Page 2, line 17 through page 3, line 3, strike job skills under.
Without
and
objection,
all that follows
the amendment will be considered as having been read, and the gentleman from Louisiana is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the bill, there are a limited group of specific entities that are designated to be certified under this program, and then it does give some discretion to the Secretary, but the Secretary of Energy had I think is in the best position to determine who are those people and organizations that are the most designated and certified to participate in this program. And I know, if I can just mention one in particular, looking through this, and I think we had some testimony earlier on the bill, the National Association of Home Builders are not included in this list, and yet there are some other groups that are. And in their group, the Home Builders Institute is actually probably as certified as anybody to be participating in this program, yet they're not listed in the bill. And rather than us picking winners and losers in the bill, I think the Secretary of Energy is the one who should be in the best position to look at groups that should be able to participate and make that decision, rather than in this bill where it does limit and in fact exclude some people that should be included in the process. So rather than picking winners and losers, this amendment just simply says the Secretary works with those groups and understands the skills necessary, and let's give him that discretion. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. The committee print contains an incentive to encourage contractors to get workforce certified for doing energy efficiency retrofits. If a contractor uses a certified workforce, a smaller percentage of their jobs need to be verified. This raises the question of which standards are workers certified. The legislation has a flexible answer to this question. Organizations that provide high-quality skills assurance will, of course, be approved for certification by the Department of Energy. But the legislation also identifies the existing accepted standards that already exist, so we can ensure that qualified workers can begin doing their work right away. The three organizations identified in the bill are universally well regarded for their efforts to certify the skills of clean energy workers. Founded in 1993, the Building Performance Institute is recognized as a world leader in certifying weatherization and efficiency retrofit workers. Since 2001, the Building Performance Institute has issued more than 10,000 certifications in all 50 states. It is a nonprofit, third-party verification company and has partnered with public and private utility sponsors in states as populous as New Jersey and as rural as Wyoming. The North American Technician Excellence is the nation's largest independent nonprofit third-party certification organization for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration technicians. NATE has certified more than 26,000 technicians in 23 skill sets. Work by NATE certified technicians resulted in 12.9% fewer callbacks and 28.4% lower warranty expense than work performed by non-certified technicians. Since its inception in 1997, NATE has administered more than 160,000 tests in all 50 states. The Laborers International Union of North America has represented construction trades since 1903 and has offered industry training and certification for more than 40 years. It currently offers more than 300 training modules, serving 120,000 individuals each year, including staff of several state and federal agencies. Their home performance skills standards meet or exceed the standards established by DOE and have been accredited by International Accreditation Services, a leading third-party body. They have credentialed 70 home performance instructors at 40 local and regional training centers across the country. This amendment would eliminate any reference to these organizations. The effect would be to place the onus for approving skill standards onto the Department of Energy, creating an unnecessary administrative hoop that could inhibit the program's ability to create clean energy jobs in a timely way. Contractors would have no clear and immediate guidance on how to develop a skilled workforce, which could result in botched installations, waste in energy, and higher costs. In order to put people to work right away, we need to speed up the approval process for groups we know, and we'll be able to ensure the quality of our workforce. This amendment would only delay this process and delay job creation. I urge members to oppose this amendment. That completes my statement. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Scalise amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The noes have it. The Scalise amendment is defeated. The gentleman from Louisiana has requested a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey.
Votes no.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Ms. Melanson votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no.
Are there other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, no.
Are there any other members seeking recognition? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote,
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Stearns votes aye.
Yeah, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 8 and the nays were 17.
The Scalise amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment of Mr. Griffith.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Griffith, page 5, line 7, insert. Not to exceed-
Without objection, the amendment of the gentleman from Alabama will be considered as having been read, and the clerk will distribute the amendment to the members for their consideration, and the gentleman from Alabama will be recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an amendment that is relatively simple in the sense that it is a sunset amendment, and it explains the language of fiscal years 2010, 2011, and simply says that the program will end or sunset at a time specific as opposed to remain in place until all funds are expended. It gives a little bit of accountability and urgency to the program.
If the gentleman could just halt for 1 second. The amendment which the gentleman is speaking to is not the amendment which was distributed to the members.
We had 2 amendments at the desk, and did you're 006 or 004?
I'm sorry, I reported 006.
Okay, well, let's talk on that one then.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, then we will consider the amendment which has been distributed as the amendment which the gentleman is going to speak on. So the gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that we have distributed is an amendment that caps the expenditure at $1 billion. The current language is the cost of the program of $6 billion. In an era or in a climate of spending that we're all concerned with, and in the wake of a $5 billion weatherization program that has not really gotten off the ground yet, this low price tag on the Homestar program, which is an excellent program, I think is a necessity. Because of the debt that we are incurring with many, many other programs, I think a $1 billion price tag would be adequate to see how this program performs, and I'll offer it to the consideration of the committee.
Right, the gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Griffin, for this amendment, because he does raise, I think, a fair question. What's the right number to make this program have a chance to succeed? but not too much, so that we're really considerate of the taxpayer and the Treasury. Because I think he speaks very well to the concern, legitimate concern, about spending. But the fundamental question for us here is, what's that number that will give this program that there appears to be strong, solid bipartisan support to accomplish? What's the number that we need in order to give it real vitality, give it a chance to succeed? And we heard from hundreds of stakeholders have been involved in designing the Homestar program. And it includes folks who are out there in the field, manufacturers, contractors, retailers, energy efficiency advocates. And they've really gone through the mechanics of what it's going to take as a minimum amount to make the program work. And the number they've arrived at is about $6 billion. And the truth is, we're asking this infrastructure that is out there to put a lot of sweat equity into this in order to make it successful. The retailers have to develop a national advertising plan to promote Homestar, get people into their stores to be able to participate. Contractors are going to go to some effort to get certified to do the energy efficiency retrofits. That's all on their own dime. And manufacturers, of course, are going to see the opportunity to ramp up production of energy efficiency products. 90% of all the materials are manufactured in our country. So for them to take that step, obviously they want to have some confidence that there are going to be people coming in to buy these products. And we're asking consumers, obviously, to plunge in these tight times, put their own skin in the game. So done right, I think all of us agree this program is a big win. I think if we're candid, we all know that there's reasonable room to debate what is the right number. There's not any magic in coming up with what it is. But the point that that I heard from many of my friends on the Republican side when I was talking about this legislation is having this open-ended commitment of such sums as may be necessary was a problem. And gentlemen, I think you were right. But the reason I think $6 million or billion should stay in here is because that's a substantial commitment to something that is going to be leverage for individuals, homeowners, putting their own money into this, and then really create that incentive for our manufacturers, our retailers, and our contractors to fully commit themselves to the program. So it's really about $6 billion being a number that's going to give this program the real chance to succeed. And, you know, we all have to exercise judgment, because a dollar spent one way returns is a good return on the investment. A dollar spent another way is a real waste. And each of us has to make our own judgments on this. I think we've all agreed pretty much that money spent on efficiency is wisely spent. While I appreciate absolutely appreciate the concern expressed by Mr. Griffin, I think the number $6 billion really is the number that we need in order to give this program. Yes, I will yield.
I thank the gentleman very much, and everything he said is absolutely true. The big box stores just don't have the incentive to do the advertising. The manufacturers will not have the stake in doing the production of these more energy efficient products, and consumers won't have kind of the ability to even learn about these programs. So we need a program at a sufficient magnitude in order to make sure that all parties have a stake in making sure that it works, and we thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back the balance of. I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I support this amendment. $1 billion to me it's not only a lot of money, but most federal programs run on considerably less. Okay. The point that I made in my opening statement was that here we passed a stimulus package a little bit more than a year ago. $4 or $5 billion was authorized to be spent and appropriated, and after a year, only about $500 million has been spent. So this is actually double what has been spent in the last year. Remember, all these were shovel-ready projects. They were supposed to be able to go, and capping this at $1 billion, you can always look at this a year or two down the road to see how fast it's drawn down. But it seems like pretty significant amount of money. You look at the cash for clunkers plan that moved through this committee. That was $3 billion. This one is twice that amount. So as is in the bill, it's $6 billion. So, as we struggle with $1.5 trillion deficit, at some point you have to say enough is enough. When is that belt going to be tightened? And I think the gentleman's amendment capping it at $1 billion is a good step in the right direction, and I would guess that most members, at least on this side, are going to be actively supporting that amendment. And I congratulate the gentleman. I yield back my time.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The vote then comes on the amendment by the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. The noes have it. The noes have it. The gentleman from Florida requests a roll call. Roll call is called. The clerk will call the tally. Call the roll of the members' names, rather.
Mr. Markey.
Votes no.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess. Okay. Mr. Burgess, aye.
Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 9 yeas and 17 nays.
The amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have an additional amendment that is 004 if at the desk.
The clerk will have the amendment distributed and will report the amendment to the committee.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Griffith. At the end of the bill, add the following new section, Section 14, sunset.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as having been read, and the gentleman from Alabama will be recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is titled a sunset amendment. This amendment sunsets the Homestar program on December the 31st, 2012. Is currently drafted. It's unclear if there's a specific end date as Section 13A, such sums as may be necessary for the period of fiscal years 2010, 2011 to remain available until expended. This clarifies that the program is sunsetted on December 31st, 2012. Creating a sunset date, I think, gives some accountability to the program and also ensures that our participants in this program understand that we are concerned that it get done and get done efficiently. So I'm hoping that our committee will consider this in a positive light. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize himself in opposition to the amendment. The amendment states that all of the provisions in this act cease to be effective on December 31st, 2012, but setting a date on which all of the provisions sunset could harm consumers and taxpayers. For instance, in the case of fraud, Section 11 of this draft authorizes the Secretary to enforce the act and assess a civil penalty if necessary. If this amendment is adopted, then these critically important enforcement provisions will simply disappear on December 31st, 2012, even if the perpetrator has not yet been brought to justice. Another example is the financing provisions in Section 12. Under these provisions, states can establish a revolving loan program in order to recycle this investment and grow our energy efficiency for years to come. Provisions in Section 12 determine the eligibility of participants and establish important safeguards to ensure that the funds are used prudently. If this amendment is adopted, the rug will be yanked out from under the states in 2012, leaving these financing programs in limbo. And furthermore, the committee print already addresses the sunset of Homestar administration. For example, Section 13 of the committee print on pages 55 authorizes funding only for fiscal year 2010 and fiscal year 2011. Additionally, the committee print shuts down the Secretary's expedited authority to enter into new contracts, hire employees, and other functions of the House of the Homestar program after fiscal year 2011. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I think it would be a much better way of protecting consumers and taxpayers to allow Homestar to be fully implemented. So with that, my time has expired with an encouragement for members to vote no. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Griffith amendment and would just want to ask counsel a few things that perhaps that the ranking subcommittee the chairman of the subcommittee has indicated, if I could. He's indicated that it would harm taxpayers by shutting this program down. I don't quite understand. Do you understand what he means by how this sunsetting this program would hurt taxpayers?
I think that's a reference to the termination while they are going on of proceedings that would be recovering taxpayer funds used under the program for rebates that were subject to a fraud or abuse prosecution. If there was the notion that there had been fraud or abuse, the program provides for recovery of those funds, but if all the provisions of the program are terminated as of the end of 2012, that authority to chase fraud and abuse funds would no longer be there, and taxpayers could forego their opportunity to recover those funds.
But if someone determines there's fraud and abuse, I'll wait till you finish, counsel, so you can listen. So if someone determines there's fraud and abuse, isn't there in a continuum of law that even though the program is shut down, they can still litigate because the fraud and abuse occurred before the program shut down, so that the continuum of law would allow them to get their case enforced if successful?
Well, it's conceivable that a fraud and abuse claim would be available but not brought until after that date if the knowledge of the fraud
Conceivably
didn't
is
come to
your
light.
word. Conceivably is your word. Let me ask you this. Was this program, in your understanding, set up as a temporary program from the beginning? I mean, that somehow has been in the language that this is a temporary program. Does the council see this as a temporary program or a program that goes on in perpetuity?
Based on the language, my understanding is this program would terminate as its authority terminates in the provisions.
And when would that be?
At the end of fiscal 2012 for funding, at the end of 2 calendar years, I believe there was a provision, 2 calendar years for...
Well, Council, if that's true, then his amendment just basically reiterates what's already in legislation. Is that true?
No, because we are already more than 2 calendar years from January 1st.
So your answer is that this is a temporary program?
That's my understanding.
Okay, if it's a temporary program, I don't see why the members would object to, and it really sort of obviates the need for not going along with the gentleman, Mr. Griffith's amendment to sunset it if it's a temporary program. Is there something wrong with my logic there?
The financing piece of this program creates loan obligations that persist beyond 2 years because the repayment obligations would not terminate, and those need to be allowed to play out as well.
And this amendment of his would stop that? I don't think so. I think, my colleagues, if you look at this, I think what he has here, all of us know there's generally has never been a temporary program.
Would the gentleman yield?
Let me just finish, then
Okay,
you
sure.
can use all the time. I mean, here is a chance, after all the talk we talk about the deficit, a simple amendment to say, let's sunset it. You know, we can reauthorize this program again. But from what the council's saying, it's implied it's a temporary program, and two, that there's already language in here to sunset it. So if that's true, then I think the gentleman's amendment just reiterates what's already in legislation, and I think we'd be looking rather foolish to deny something that's already understood, and the council's indicated that the continuum of law would allow the authority to go forward even if we had, for some reason, to stop this program.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Absolutely.
Thank you. Again, and I think council has made this clear. The funding does sunset, but there are other provisions in the law. For example, if a fraudster is perpetrating a crime at some point, let us say near the end of the program in terms of the funding, we want to ensure that we have retained full legal capacity in order to pursue the wrongdoing. So what I would suggest to the gentleman from Alabama, if he would withdraw the amendment at this time without prejudicing his rights at all for full committee, we will try to work with the gentleman on this in order to make sure that there is a clarification that does satisfy the goals which I think all of the members of the committee would want to pursue. And if we could have that conversation between now and full committee, I think that there is a pretty fair chance that we'll be able to resolve the issue.
Mr. Chairman,
in response to Alabama.
Thank you. In response to your request, I would say that I would withdraw with the provisions that you've stipulated, and would say that if we are concerned about fraud and abuse and the pursuit of justice in such a claim at the end of the program, are we then going to escrow funding and have it exist throughout the statute of limitations? I think we could reach an agreement if we discuss this so that we could have a finite period of time. Also, I think we need to let our vendors know that we are serious about this program because it's a good program. And $100,000 remaining in the account at the end of 2012, does that mean the program is extended for I think we could clarify that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your suggestion, and I would follow it.
Well, the
Thank you.
gentleman, through Mr. Stearns' time has made a motion that his amendment be withdrawn without objection, so ordered, and again, without prejudice. We will work with the gentleman in order to pursue truth, justice, and the American way between now and the full committee, and try to identify where we agree on what those terms mean. And we thank the gentleman for that clarification. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time?
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr.
Just
Barton.
strike the requisite number of words, and I don't have
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
I just want to clarify what just transpired. We withdrawn the explicit sunset motion with the understanding that the chairman is interested in working to clarify that. Does that mean that the chair and the majority does agree in principle there should be some sunset? It's just a question of how to do it and what parameters are exempted in terms of ongoing investigations and things of this sort.
Again, there are parts of this program that obviously do sunset. We want to do is to ensure that we don't invoke the law of unintended consequences by having overbroad language which is adopted that then would limit our ability to ensure especially that there is proper policing of the program and that deterrents are put in place in order to ensure that malefactors are not encouraged to think that they might be able to perpetrate crimes near the end of the program thinking that they can escape prosecution. But I think during the course of our discussion, we will be able to find a way of resolving this issue, and if the gentleman is willing to work with us, then that would be our goal, and I give the gentleman my commitment and the commitment of the majority to accomplish that goal.
Well, I will get my Webster's Dictionary and practice my multi-syllable words, and we will be prepared to engage in those multi-party discussions.
I know that the gentleman has a master's degree in engineering from Purdue, and I'm sure that at that level he was taught many words that would completely make it impossible for the rest of us to understand what it was that he was talking about. Unfortunately, law school bestows that same type of parallel universe vocabulary upon those who go to law school, if only to extract higher fees from clients to have it translated into English. So that's I think that's the whole point of graduate school.
Well, I'll ask Mr. Welch to translate for me as we go through these discussions. With that, I yield back.
Without objection, we thank the gentleman. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? Is the gentleman from Oklahoma seeking recognition? He is not. Okay. The chair does not see any other members who are seeking recognition at this time, and there being no further discussion, the question occurs on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The manager's amendment is adopted, and the motion now comes on moving that the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment forward the committee print of the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act of 2010 as amended to the full committee with the recommendations that the bill pass. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Homestar Energy Retrofit Act of 2010, as amended, is favorably forwarded to the full committee. We thank all members of the subcommittee for their help in moving this bill, and now we move to the final bill under consideration. The chair now calls up H.R. 4451, the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act. The clerk will report the title of the measure.
H.R. 4451, a bill to reinstate and transfer certain hydroelectric.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member seek recognition at this time? The chair will recognize himself for a brief statement to explain why I am supporting this legislation. Christopher Murphy of Connecticut introduced this bill in January. It focuses on two small hydroelectric projects located 2 miles apart on the Farmington River in Connecticut. The two dams were originally built to power an axe factory, but have not produced power since the factory was shut down in 1966. In 2001, a private company obtained 2 licenses from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to redevelop the hydro capacity at these dams, but the company failed to start construction before the deadline in the permit. As a result, the licenses were terminated in December of 2007. Now the town of Canton wanted to proceed with the hydro projects, which would provide about 2 megawatts and would power 1,600 to 2,000 homes. The Murphy bill authorizes the FERC to reinstate the terminated licenses, extend the deadline for commencing construction for 2 years, and transfer the licenses to the town of Canton. It also provides for an updated environmental assessment of the planned projects, which will help to inform FERC's decision on whether to reinstate the licenses. Mr. Murphy has spent a lot of time working with stakeholders to produce a bill they could all support. We have letters of support from the town of Canton, the local Watershed Association, the local Wild and Scenic Study Committee, the American Rivers, the leading river conservation group in the country. Mr. Murphy also worked with the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, and the department has assured my staff that it is comfortable with the bill. My staff has also consulted with the FERC on the bill, and FERC has no objections. In short, this is a non-controversial bill. The committee has a history of considering hydro licensing bills like this. I think it is a good bill, and I encourage my colleagues to support it. That completes the statement of the chair. We now turn and look for any other members who are seeking recognition. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is seeking recognition, and he will be recognized to speak on this amendment.
Just have a question. I want to make sure the license that was granted in 2001 has been terminated and cannot be reinstated. There is no question of there being 2 licenses out at the same time if this bill becomes law. That's my only question.
That is correct. The license cannot be reinstated without action from this committee.
So if this bill becomes law, the only licensee that can generate hydroelectric power subject to FERC approval is the town of Canton, Connecticut. Is that correct?
The licenses would be reinstated and transferred to the town of Canton under this legislation, and then the town of Canton would be responsible, yes.
But there is no, and I'm not a hydroelectric expert, but the licensee who had the licenses has no ability to contest the veracity of this license in some sort of a proceeding before FERC. I just want to make sure that we don't get 2 competing owners. I know this is a public entity and the other was a private, but I don't want the private entity to step forward and have some claim that would conflict with this one. That's my only concern.
I am told by counsel that cannot happen under this legislation, and I am convinced that is the case. This is something that is very small, very narrow, and the intent of the language and its effect accomplishes the goal which the gentleman is seeking to clarify.
Then I have no objection and would support the legislation.
We thank the gentleman, and I thank the gentleman for his inquiry. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair sees none. The chair will just recognize himself briefly to just tell the committee that I was chairman of this subcommittee in 1985 and 86, and we had to work for 1 year on the Hydroelectric Relicensing Act of 1986, which are all the dams in the country that come under the jurisdiction of this committee. And we should just be thankful that this is the full extent to which right now we're being asked to look at all of those facilities across the country that we have jurisdiction over. So the chair then sees no other members seeking recognition. There being no further discussion, I now move that the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment forward H.R. 4451, the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act, to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, and the Collinsville Renewable Energy Promotion Act is favorably forwarded to the full committee. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections to the measures forwarded at today's markup without objection. So ordered. There being no further business before the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas.
I just want to make an announcement. If you're on the Bobby Rush subcommittee, his markup is supposed to recommence at 1 p.m.
We thank the gentleman for that announcement. All members on that subcommittee are so notified. With the thanks of the subcommittee, this hearing is adjourned.